Hi, I'm Dr. Elisabeth Kramer from the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. Thank you so much for joining us for our Politics in Action event online. This is a Q&A session with our Malaysia expert, Dr. Sebastian Dettman from the Singapore Management University, who's going to be answering some of the questions that our viewers sent in for him. If you haven't yet had a chance to watch his video, you can head over to the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre Facebook page or our YouTube channel to watch it there before we go through the questions. Thank you so much, Sebastian, for taking the time to answer these questions for me. It's really great to have you on the line.
Great, thanks for having me.
Okay, so I've got a handful of questions here from our viewers, and I'll just jump in with our very first one that reads, as an outsider to Malaysian politics, it is discouraging for me to see from recent events how ultimately the Malaysian elites just pass power back and forth amongst themselves. I would imagine that Malaysians themselves may be tiring of how politics is only ever decided by a very small number of people. So Sebastian, the question is, are there any expectations that this system will change over time as the old guard dies out, or is it built into the way that the Malaysian political system is constructed?
So yeah, I thought that's a great question, and I think in the presentation I did highlight some of that kind of elite shuffling of power between politicians without sort of any popular mandate at this point. But I would maybe take a more optimistic tone in answering that question, in the sense that the May 2018 election, even if the results ended up the government didn't survive, I think it does set a powerful precedent for people's voice and people's action in elections, for example. So I would say first that there is a little bit of space for ordinary Malaysians to influence the course of politics. So I don't think all hope is lost. And I would also say it is true, as the questioner mentioned, that we're seeing a lot of the same personalities, a lot of the same politicians now contesting on one or the other sides of these different coalitions. And so, while there is a certain amount of continuity in who the politicians are, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I mean, I think we've seen in other cases in Southeast Asia that you do see the persistence of elites from the old order. I mean, or the new order, as it were, in Indonesia, for example, right? So. But they're now playing different roles. They now are put into new political incentives, and so I think even if the personnel can remain the same for quite a long time, I think the incentives which politicians face even now is different than the one that they faced just a couple of years ago. So I would be a little bit optimistic that there is still room for some sort of change in Malaysian politics going forward.
Okay, great. And my next question here relates specifically to one of the key players in Malaysian politics these days. What are your thoughts on Anwar Ibrahim's role moving forward? Is there still a role for him to play, and do ordinary Malaysians still support him?
Yeah, I think Anwar definitely still has a role, even if his sort of coronation of him as prime minister didn't go off as it seemed to have been planned. But I think, we haven't seen the last of Anwar in Malaysia's political scene. In fact, he's been extremely influential in Malaysian politics, even though he hasn't risen to a level beyond MP over the past, 20 years or more. So I think Anwar will continue to influence Malaysian politics in some role. Whether or not he's actually going to become prime minister in the end, I think is it's so unpredictable, and it's gotten a lot more unpredictable. So I wouldn't hazard a guess either way. I mean, my sense is the recent events, to put it mildly, have not confirmed that he's got a great grasp over his own party, and he may be passed over in the future for this pick. But at the same time, he's one of a few Malaysian politicians with a very strong national recognition and perhaps appeal to voters as well. So barring a new generation of leaders coming into power, I think he still has quite a bit of name recognition, gravitas, and sort of an image as being a reform-minded politician. So I think there is a future for him, whether or not he's prime minister or not.
Excellent. My next question here, you mentioned in your talk that the Pakatan Harapan government came to power promising sweeping reforms. However, as you also discussed quite at some length, there was a lot of internal dissent within the coalition after they won. Were there actually any real reform policies implemented in the time that they did hold government? And if so, what impact have they had in Malaysia to date?
Yeah, so another good question. I think I would say there are reforms which were written into practice or law, which I think will perhaps be more durable over time. And there are ones which I think are sort of precedents which have been set by the government, which may or may not last beyond the Pakatan Harapan government's time. But just to quote a few, I wrote down some. If we look at, I mentioned these in the presentation actually, but the Elections Commission, which was previously under the Prime Minister's office, is now under parliamentary oversight, so it's a bit more independent. The voting age has been lowered to 18. There's provisions now for automatic voter registration in Malaysia. There's been some modest parliamentary reforms. There have been some loosening of rules around political activities and protests. We see both for example, university students, also for protests themselves, which is not to say it's become fully free, but it's a bit freer than it was previously. And I think, in terms of precedents, I would say that the actions that the government pursued against the former prime minister and some of the most powerful politicians in the country, I would put that in sort of the precedent category. And it's still unclear how those cases are going to be resolved in Malaysia, how free they are going to be from political influence or interference. But I would say that, we see in a lot of countries which deal with massive corruption scandals or, transitions of power, those leaders, it's very difficult to actually prosecute those types of leaders. So, but even I think setting the precedent that those politicians were at least being held to account and put through a process, the rule of, a legal process, I think is, again, sort of an important precedent. So, maybe there's a perspective which would say, there are a lot of fundamental things about Malaysian politics which haven't changed since the Alliance of Hope came to power, or during its period in power, rather. So, for example, if you look at the system of state-owned enterprises in Malaysia, which are called government-linked companies, there hasn't been a lot of change in how, for example, directorships are being apportioned by the ruling government in sort of a patronage way. And Terence Gomez, an academic in Malaysia, has written quite a lot about this as well. So I'd encourage people to read his work on that as well. So, I think other things, for example, local elections. There's no local elections in Malaysia. That was something which at least some of the Pakatan Harapan politicians had pushed for, even if Mahathir himself had not been on board that. But that's another thing which kind of fell by the wayside and hasn't really changed and is unlikely to change under the new government. And then things like the Sedition Act. There's still a Sedition Act which is used against opponents of the government, critics of the government, and that remained under Pakatan Harapan, and presumably will be used by the new government as well. So I would say, there's one perspective would be to say, well, there hasn't been a lot of movement on these sort of more fundamental shifts in how Malaysia's political economy or how Malaysian politics work. But again, maybe taking sort of the optimistic viewpoint, I think the reform or democratization process takes a long time, as we've seen in other Southeast Asian countries. Again, going to Indonesia or the Philippines or these other cases in Southeast Asia, it's a halting progress, and then sometimes it gets reversed, and it's not sort of a linear progress towards change. But again, I would say that there has been precedent set for reform, and the fact that the government is was changed through elections, again, I think is a really important change, and we shouldn't discount that change, even if the government which was elected proved to be short-lived.
And that actually segues nicely into my next question here, which asks about the most recent government formation, which came to power outside of the electoral process. Do you think that the fact that it was formed in this way and came to power in this way could undermine its legitimacy in the eyes of the public? And how do you think that coming to power without having gone to an election beforehand will affect the new administration?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first I would note one thing is that even since that presentation that I gave, there's been some more sort of ferment at the elite level in Malaysia. So there's going to be a parliamentary sitting, for example, on May 18th, which is only going to last a single day. There's now going to be a vote of no confidence against the current prime minister. So, you know, just based on what I've been reading, it seems like most observers see that the new government will probably survive by a narrow margin. But at the same time, I think it suggests that even at the elite level, there's still important kinks to be worked out amongst the current government. So at the popular level, I do think, yeah, I think there is a segment of Malaysia's population which will see this government as being fundamentally sort of illegitimate in some way, even if it's from a legal perspective not illegitimate, but from the perspective of it was sort of an overturning of the mandate of the people, basically, in 2018. And I think the question, this will really be resolved in the next election, whenever that takes place. And I think a lot of that will have to do with how the government handles the sort of economic and political fallout from the coronavirus situation right now, but even how it handles some of its internal politics. So because Malaysia's system of government is a first past the post system, there's this strong incentive for the government to try to place a single candidate into a single parliamentary district. So what that means is that the government has to figure out, okay, amongst the three Malay majority parties that we have in government, who do we choose to be in seat X? And that's going to be a huge negotiation amongst these parties if the current government survives, because they're all kind of vying for the same ground. They all try to appeal to the same voters. So how that's going to translate in terms of voter sentiment, I think remains to be seen, and it just needs to be figured out at the elite level before. And it's not even necessarily clear that that the current government can figure that out in its current arrangement. So yeah, I guess the sort of lame answer would be to say it remains to be seen, but I think we're still far away from another general election at this point.
Okay, and my final question here, a lot of the presentations that we had over the last week spoke about the impact of the coronavirus, COVID-19, in various countries across Southeast Asia, and obviously Malaysia is affected, just like all the other countries in the region. Could you tell us a little bit about how the coronavirus pandemic has affected ethnic tensions in Malaysia?
Yeah, so I think at the beginning of the crisis, you know, we saw in not only in Malaysia but in other countries, there's sort of a backlash against people, either ethnic Chinese or people who are sort of somehow associated or actually from China. And there was a little bit of that from what I read in Malaysia, but my sense right now is that that's not the main sort of ethnic tension going on. In fact, I would think from the perspective of that, the major issue are sort of, you know, marginalized communities in Malaysia right now, which are often migrant workers or refugees, Rohingya refugees, which have been the target of some online ire or anti-Rohingya, anti-refugee sentiment. So I think those are the types of communities which I think will face the most immediate impacts to any sort of scapegoating or vilification of groups in Malaysian society. From the perspective of, for example, ethnic Chinese in Malaysia or Chinese nationals in Malaysia, my sort of superficial sense at this point is that that's not going to be a major issue at this point. But you know, I think there's again the question of how political elites will use these issues going forward. Frankly, I mean, I think you know, what we saw in Malaysia leading up to this change in government was a bit of not scapegoating, but a sort of a stoking of ethnic sentiments and ethnic tensions for the purpose of delegitimizing the government. And now that there has been this change in government, I think that message for the current government is not, they won't use that as much. I mean, it doesn't resonate as much to use that message at this point. So I don't think there is going to be a lot of incentives on the opposition or ruling side to stoke those particular ethnic tensions. But you know, if there's mass unemployment in Malaysia, I mean, there has been a spike in unemployment in Malaysia, which has just been reported from March. So presumably over the next couple months, we'll see worsening of the economic situation. I was even reading, you know, there's some competition between migrant workers or foreign workers over the and sort of Malaysian nationals over certain jobs, which were previously mostly dominated by foreign workers, but now unemployed Malaysians may be competing for those jobs as well. So that's where I see the kind of ethnic tensions playing out in Malaysia during this current COVID situation.
Great, thank you, Sebastian. Those are all of the questions that I have for you today. A big thank you for giving us some of your time. It's been great to get a little bit more clarification on some of these questions, so thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
And for our viewers, just in case you've forgotten or you would like to share the Politics in Action videos with your friends, you can find Sebastian's video and other ones on Laos, Myanmar, the Philippines, Vietnam and Indonesia over at the Sydney Southeast Asia Facebook page and on our YouTube channel as well. Bye for now.